Welcome to this online talk, not a place where people walk in fear, searching for Altab, race, housing and the Greater London Council in Spitalfields 1970s to 1980s. It's been developed from a paper I gave at a symposium, Race, Violence and the City, held at London School of Economics in 2018 to commemorate the 40-year anniversary of the racist murder of Altab Ali. The slides are in the main images of records held at London Metropolitan Archives. It's modest in terms of archival research. There are scholars and activists whose greater knowledge of the events I have relied upon. There are also researchers currently studying this topic afresh, and a number of exciting oral history projects which will add to our understanding of this important chapter in London's history. What follows is inspired by those who argue that archivists and historians must commit to decolonising history and archives. I hope it raises some questions about the limits of the official archive to adequately capture the incidences and experiences of racism. By querying the extent to which institutional racism can be explored using the archives of the institution, it comes to a number of conclusions. That we, as archivists, must acknowledge that silence is a key weapon in the survival of white supremacy, that these silences need to be explored, read and exposed, even if we cannot always fill them, that doing so is itself an act of rebalancing, however small, and finally that silences in archives are rarely absolute. But first, some background. Altab Ali was a young Bangladeshi man who was murdered in a racist attack in Spitalfields in 1978. The killing was a tragic escalation of the racial violence to which Spitalfield's minority populations, predominantly Bangladeshis, had long been subjected. Altab was murdered on the 4th of May 1978, the day of the local elections in London, elections which had been fought in racially charged circumstances. Public iterations of anti-immigrant sentiments were common in 1978. Here we have a quote by Margaret Thatcher, then leader of the Conservative Party, soon to be elected Prime Minister in the 1979 general election. Thatcher was responding to the rise of the National Front as an electoral force in the previous years by incorporating their ideas into mainstream politics. In January 1978 she said, "People are really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture." In 1978, 41 National Front candidates stood in the local elections. Altab's death is seen by many as a watershed in the history of Bangladeshis in the East End. Bangladeshi communities mobilised in numbers to resist, fight, demonstrate, strike and reclaim the streets. On the 14th of May, a protest march from Brick Lane to Downing Street behind Altab Ali's coffin was one of the biggest demonstrations by Asians in Britain to date. The Battle of Brick Lane, as this resistance became known in the summer of 1978, echoed the Battle of Cable Street, which had rejected Oswald Mosley's black shirts in the 1930s. When I started this project, my aim was to explore the events surrounding the murder of Altab Ali and the racism Bangladeshi communities experienced and resisted through use of archival sources held at London Metropolitan Archives, and in particular the archive of the Greater London Council, the GLC. The GLC was the elected local authority for London between 1965 and 1986, and an important player in Spitalfields during the 1970s, wielding huge responsibility for the area's inhabitants. I assumed therefore that there'd be an abundance of source material, but things were not quite so straightforward. So let's begin with the quote from my title. It's provocative given what we know happened in 1978. It describes Spitalfields in 1977 and was printed in the Times newspaper on the 23rd of December of that year. The full quote is, "Racialism exists in the East End and the Bengalis get their share of it, but there is a great deal of exaggeration about the extent to which they suffer. It is not a place where people walk in fear." It's even more provocative when you see that the quote comes from Inspector John Wallace, Community Liaison Officer with the Metropolitan Police, the police officer with specific responsibility to investigate and protect communities in the East End from racist attacks at the time. In contrast, here we have the most detailed report on the racial violence in 1978. It was published by the Bethnal Green and Stepney Trades Council in September 1978 and called Blood on the Streets. This is my copy. It doesn't feature in the GLC collections. And it makes sobering reading. 107 separate violent racial attacks against Bangladeshis are listed for Tower Hamlets during the period January 76 to August 78. An epidemic of violence laid bare. And it's a resounding challenge to the aforementioned quote. The gulf between the official line and the grassroots report is astounding. Here we have some more quotes, this time from a report published by the Home Office on racial attacks in November 1981. It's written by Home Secretary William Whitelaw, and in it he now formally acknowledges that racially motivated attacks exist, and he describes them as wicked crimes. But he goes on to say that any failure to recognise the problem before this date can be explained by a lack of reliable information. The important thing here is not so much the acknowledgement that racial harassment might be happening, It's that there is a lack of evidence to prove its existence. The search for this reliable information is one of the subjects of this talk. If we return to the blood on the streets, one of the most striking things about many of the 107 attacks listed is that they took place on GLC-run housing estates. And yet, when we turn to the GLC archive for the period, there are no references to any of them. The records I was expecting to find were simply not there. Not lost, not destroyed even, just seemingly non-existent. I encountered silence. Now, there's much to admire about the GLC. It enacted progressive policies, built important London landmarks, and became such a thorn in the side of the Conservative government on its doorstep that it was abolished by Thatcher in 1986. It's a narrative that we as archivists promote through exhibitions and articles, and by prioritising particular aspects of collections for cataloguing because they fit the narrative. But behind these feel-good, headline-grabbing stories, there are glimpses of hidden histories, less often told, more elusive, and as we shall see, harder to acknowledge as key threads running through London and UK history. The silence we encounter in the archive is not incidental. Silence appears to have been at the heart of how the GLC approached racism in the 1970s. A memo of May 1975, for example, on the subject of race relations identifies a reluctance to contemplate an explicit commitment on behalf of the council, and that keeping a low profile is more comfortable. But the GLC was not just complicit in racism by consistently choosing to ignore it. If we examine these admissions in the context of wider council policies, particularly in the sphere of housing, we see that the failure to acknowledge and address incidences of racism on its housing estates was central to the way the GLC official housing policies operated. In fact, challenging such racist violence would have exposed the racism at the very heart of these policies, something which the GLC was forced to address very publicly in the summer of 1978, as we shall see. So the GLC was the housing authority for Tower Hamlets, a role it shared with the London Borough of Tower Hamlets until 1986. It managed some 36,000 homes in the borough. And our trail begins with the minutes of the GLC on the 20th of June 1978. Councillors are concerned that a document has been leaked to the press, which has resulted in the GLC's housing department facing very public accusations that its housing allocation policies towards Bangladeshis in Tower Hamlets are racist. The document in question, seen here, was a report agreed by the chair of the Housing Committee in May 1978 and written by Len Bennett, Director of Housing. In it, he suggested that the solution to the Bangladeshi housing problems was to set aside a few blocks of flats in or near Spitalfields specifically for the occupation of people from Bangladesh, that such a step be in the nature of an experiment to see whether a specific estate or area set aside for a particular community group achieves a desirable solution to a difficult social problem. It was leaked to the Observer newspaper on the 6th of June, and the plan was immediately dubbed the Ghetto Plan. And to the embarrassment of the GLC, it was championed by the apartheid South African government in Pretoria. But to understand the context, we need some background. Spitalfields in 1978 was considered one of the most deprived areas, not just in London, but in the UK as a whole. The situation was well known. A GLC report submitted to the Housing Management Committee on the 26th of September 1974 describes Spitalfields wards as follows: a mixture of conflicting land uses, including a large number of rag trade workshops, local authority housing estates and overcrowded privately rented housing, mostly in poor condition. A large proportion of the buildings are obsolescent. The physical problems are matched by a large number of special problems, a concentration of poorly educated and non-integrated Bangladeshi immigrants, and a large number of homeless people, including vagrants and meth drinkers. We have a good visual record of the Spitalfields area in the 1970s, courtesy of the GLC's Architects Department. As an archival record of a changing landscape, they are fantastic. The following photos are all the streets around Brick Lane between 1974 and 1979, although to me they could be of a more distant time. They depict a rundown, forgotten area. We have rotting houses, half-demolished properties, and abandoned sites. In 1978, a fifth of the Spitalfields area lay undeveloped. The history of Bengali settlement in the area is long-standing. The first settlers were Lascars, men working on merchant ships docking at Millwall, Limehouse, Wapping and Shadwell. But post-war labour shortages saw more concerted numbers arrive from the subcontinent. Here we see an image of Old Montague Street in 1961, and we see many continuities with earlier East End migrant communities. So Bangladeshis are praying in old synagogues. They're making clothes in old Huguenot weavers' houses. And they're adapting businesses to meet social and cultural needs. Despite the prevalent myths to the contrary, Bangladeshis were not taking all the council housing in the 1970s. The National Dwelling and Housing Survey, taken in 1978, showed that in Spitalfields ward, where Bangladeshis made up 47% of the population, only 5% were living in council houses. Most Bangladeshis lived in privately rented, multi-occupied dwellings in and around the Brick Lane area, such as this one. And when you consider that private housing constituted under 10% of the entire housing stock in Tower Hamlets, the pool of available accommodation was tiny. Add to that further problems of racist landlords, and options were severely reduced. These images, and the ones before, are from a household in Buxton Street in the early 1970s. The file suggests it was probably an all-male household, and it was leased to a Bangladeshi man. It falls into the GLC's compulsory purchase order scheme and is acquired by the council, which is why LMA has the file. Many places were clearly not in as good a condition as this. Options were so limited and conditions so bad in Spitalfields that many tenants were compelled to live in slum conditions. A GLC survey of the condition of private houses in 1978 showed that over 90% were unfit for habitation. So here we have a photo of houses in Sheba Street. The condition of one of the properties is described as follows. In the front passage there is a mass of old meters and wiring. Ahead is the staircase. Several stairs are loose. The plaster on the underside of the stairs is damp and perished. The upstairs toilet leaks. The roof is shot. In storms, water finds its way down to the ground. A family of 7 sleeps in the front room. The toilet is in the backyard. The door from the passage to the backyard has no catch and bangs in the wind. The soil stack from the upstairs toilet also leaks down the wall. This makes the wall damp, and sewage seeps through it into the plasterwork inside the kitchen. Many such dwellings were certified as unfit for human habitation by the council's medical officer of health. 2 examples of these are Wentworth Dwellings, shown here in 1975, and Brunswick Buildings, also in 1975. These 2 buildings were a microcosm of experience for some and arguably significant numbers of Bangladeshis. Both were built as solutions to social problems in the area in the 19th century, as attempts at slum clearance to break up the squalor of the rookeries, 18th century slums which at the time housed the underclasses and poorest people of London. The Victorian solution was to destroy the neighbourhood, scatter the population and build tenement model buildings with higher rents which only the better working class could afford, an early nod to gentrification. The quote here is from an 1884 submission to Parliament and gives an idea of slum conditions. It's a woman describing her home. Look there, at that great hole, the landlord will not mend it. I have every night to sit up and watch, or my husband sits up to watch, because that hole is over a common sewer, and the rats come up sometimes 20 at a time, and if we did not watch them, they would eat the baby up. In a case of history repeating itself, 100 years later we have the same situation. The following is from a letter dated the 11th of February 1976, written by a Bangladeshi tenant of Brunswick Buildings. Sir, I request you please kindly do something for me because there are so many rats in my room. My children cannot eat food. When they go to sleep, many rats bite their fingers. They're all the time frightened. Overcrowding in Wentworth is clear from another survey. In 1961, 278 people lived in 166 flats in the dwellings. In 1980, 327 lived in 68 flats. The electoral register shows that in 1960 there were no Bangladeshi tenants. By the 1970s, the majority of residents were Bangladeshi. Wentworth had in fact been condemned years before they moved in. The continuing existence of seething, filthy, vermin-infested tenements such as Wentworth Dwellings is a public scandal, was the conclusion of one report in 1972. And in May 1976, the Mirror newspaper called it the unacceptable face of Britain. So by the late 1970s, the GLC was under some pressure to do something about it. It started to acquire these sites as compulsory purchase orders under slum clearance programs. It promised to redevelop the area, but with development came newfound responsibility. It needed to rehouse the inhabitants, and this is the first time that significant numbers of Bangladeshis came into contact with the council housing departments, and their experience was not a good one. The GLC housing files, if read closely, give an indication of the hostile environment created by the GLC rehousing of Brunswick and Wentworth tenants. Officials show little regard for the choice of areas for rehousing. Offers are non-negotiable. Files show an annoyance at refusals of offers. There's no use of interpreters. Information is poorly acquired. Names are mangled. There are refusals to rehouse subtenants even though they make up 1/3 of inhabitants. There is common recourse to repossession orders. accusations of voluntary homelessness if families return to Bangladesh during the process, and later files indicate complaints that passports are being checked. So far from supportive. But it's not just the process of rehousing, the resulting offers are poor as well. In 1975, a Runnymede report had accused the GLC of a racist allocations policy in housing. It argued that ethnic minorities were being offered the poorest accommodation on the oldest estates and having to suffer the poorest conditions. The GLC response is defensive. It commissions its own report in 1976, which accepts some of the findings but not accusations of racism. We sense annoyance in the housing files that residents of Wentworth and Brunswick are refusing offers outside the immediate E1 area. There is a real sense that if only Bangladeshis would be less picky, then there would be enough to go round. Here we have a housing official expressing the same point in a published letter. The implication is that conflict will only be avoided if Bangladeshi tenants accept what they are offered and the race relations industry stops making special pleas on their behalf. And so we're brought back to the elephant in the room. There is little discussion of the racial violence which was forcing Bangladeshis to reject particular areas. The files don't explain that refusals were generally because the estates they were being offered had become no-go areas for Asians. Incidentally, the term no-go areas was a phrase the officials considered inappropriate and often removed from draft reports. They preferred the concept of unsafe estates, but unsafe is always in inverted commas. The effect is to introduce a sense of scepticism, and in fact racial attacks were not considered acceptable grounds for emergency transfers by the GLC until 1983. Here we have the Coventry Cross estate in Bromley by Bow. Len Bennett, Director of Housing in the infamous 1978 report, actually uses the Coventry Cross estate as an example of successful dispersal policies. Yet a later report from 1982 shows that out of the first 32 Asian families to transfer to the estate, all but 4 had suffered racial abuse. In essence, most Bangladeshis wanted the choice in housing transfers afforded to other white residents, including access to modern flats in their location of choice. But the way housing was managed in Spitalfields allowed racist violence to develop to the point where it became very difficult for Bangladeshi tenants to exercise any choice about where they wanted to live. Bangladeshis tended to be directed to older estates because they were the hard-to-let properties which white residents didn't want. Although the GLC claimed it allocated housing according to need, in reality it followed a housing ladder ethos, based as it was on the Victorian categorisations of deserving and non-deserving poor. The GLC was in effect limiting the estates it was prepared to send Bangladeshis to, and ensuring that new and modern estates in Tower Hamlets became the exclusive preserve of white populations. In this way, the council actively contributed to increases in racial harassment by encouraging tenants on all white estates to see those estates as theirs and resist any Bangladeshi transfers. In this respect, the policies of separation predated the ghetto plan as articulated in 1978. The plan was merely a crude and public expression of the realities of council policies over the years. The idea that Bangladeshis only wanted to live in Bangladeshi-only areas was a reality forced upon them. The GLC was to later claim that it was what the majority of Bangladeshis wanted. Later still, it shamelessly said that allocations were to protect them from racism. Here we see the Naz Cinema in Brick Lane, an important cultural venue for Bangladeshis in the 1970s. On the 12th of June 1976, the Anti-Racist Committee of Asians in East London held a mass meeting here, followed by a protest march to Leman Street Police Station, demanding action to keep blood off the streets. The event was in response to the racist murder of Gurdeep Singh Chuggar in Southall on the 4th of June, and is an indication of how the events of 1978 built on existing traditions of resistance across London and the UK. Unsurprisingly, the invisibility of racism in the official archive is matched by similar silences on resistance. There is a danger that official records construct minority groups in policy documentation as passive victims, thereby bypassing this long-standing grassroots history of resistance. That the GLC was forced to publicly address its housing policies is mainly down to external pressure from local groups and movements which grew from within Spitalfield's Bangladeshi communities. We see glimpses in the records. One such group was the Bengali Housing Action Group, founded in February 1976. In the mid-1970s, squatters were making homes in housing left empty by over-ambitious council slum clearance programmes. This was itself an act of resistance. Some were homeless families who'd been rehoused on white estates and had been abused back to E1 by systemic racist violence. Others looked for places to squat to avoid this fate, as the council was offering them nothing through the waiting list. By the summer of 1975, mass squats had moved into a number of the streets around Spitalfields. Here we have an example of a squat in Nelson Street. Quite quickly the situation became too big for the council to deal with. The most newsworthy squat was in Pelham Buildings on Deal Street, another 19th century tenement block similar to Wentworth and Brunswick, which the GLC wished to clear and redevelop. BAG was able to use strength in numbers to negotiate rehousing in the local area, and ultimately it was successful. It forced an amnesty, and residents were rehoused on the 13 named estates they wished to be transferred to. BAG was only one of a number of groups which campaigned to improve the housing conditions of local Bangladeshis. Organisations such as Spitalfields Housing and Planning Rights Service and Spitalfields Housing Cooperative actively campaigned and called the GLC to account. 1978 was also a turning point in the development of a number of Bangladeshi-led community activist groups, mainly set up by younger generations to expose racism and fight it in all its forms. So groups such as the Bangladesh Youth Movement, the Bangladesh Youth Front, the Bangladesh Youth League and the Federation of Bangladeshi Youth Organisations. Many of these groups have their origins in the struggles of 1978 and went on to play a major part in local politics thereafter. They held the GLC and London Borough of Tower Hamlets to account, applying pressure when necessary and campaigning on a variety of issues. Here we see examples of some reports submitted to the GLC under various grant bids for funding in the 1980s. Reading through them, we encounter not only the experiences of racism, but also concerted resistance at the grassroots level. And so we come to the postscript. In 1981, a new Labour administration was elected to the GLC with more progressive and left-wing credentials. New manifestos committed the council to anti-racist, anti-sexist and anti-homophobic standpoints. In a major change, the GLC began to openly debate the issues it had been so reluctant to address publicly previously, and the net result from an archival point of view is that the 1980s are better documented. Crucially, two major inquiries were commissioned. The first was into racial harassment by the newly formed police committee and was published in 1984. It gives testimony to the extent of racial violence suffered, with particular emphasis on housing estates in Tower Hamlets. It calls for a need to tackle institutional racism in the police force, over a decade before the Macpherson report. The other, What Price Equality by Deborah Phillips, was published in 1986 and examined the workings of the housing department, exposing the institutional racism in detail. In effect, this is the smoking gun that the 1970s records failed to provide. One quote from its findings encapsulates the allocations policy discussed above. A disturbing level of racist comment and joking was witnessed by the researcher. Bengalis in particular were commonly stereotyped as dirty, troublemakers and causing problems on estates. Several officers offered remarkably similar solutions, that is, to put all the Bengalis together in E1 and to allocate them to poorer estates. Their view was that they would turn them into slums anyway. Despite the mandate, change was painfully slow in the 1980s. It was consistently resisted by housing officials, and the gulf between the GLC's newfound policy directions and the realities of policy delivery produced some paradoxes and contradictions. So here we have on the left a GLC-produced poster raising awareness of the very issues GLC housing policies were producing. On the right, a GLC-funded group actively opposing council policy. So to conclude, there is a fundamental inconsistency running through this talk. On the one hand, the aim has been to show how the archive collections at London Metropolitan Archives can go some way to construct the lives of some of Spitalfields residents in the 1970s. On the other, it spends some considerable time exposing the lack of documentary evidence available to do this. It is clear that archives can conceal as much as enlighten. As archivists and researchers, we need to be aware of the limits of the archive, both in terms of content and cataloguing. While we can read the silences and omissions in archives so that they in fact speak volumes and become a damning indictment of how pervasive racism was and still is, we also need to plug the gaps between official histories and the realities of grassroots experiences, so that these experiences are preserved for future generations. The immutability of the archive is both a strength and a weakness. In time, there is a danger that the longevity of the official archive will outlive the relative fragility of other experiences. The racist murder of Al-Tabali and countless others will, I hope, never be forgotten, but we need to be vigilant to ensure that this is the case. I'd like to end on a more personal note. So let's return to the image of the demonstration on Brick Lane in 1978. It's the only such image we have of the events at London Metropolitan Archives, and I was very familiar with it, having used it over the years for various talks and events. Then one day I was looking at it once more, and a familiar face popped out. There in the thick of the crowd was my cousin-in-law Jamal Hassan, a man I'd known for 25 years. It was a wonderful moment to realise such a direct connection, and it goes to show, the more you look at what you think you know, the more you find.